My name is Shlomo or Solly Angel, and I'm a professor of city planning at the Marron Institute of Urban Management at New York University. I'm sitting here today with my friend and colleague, Professor Michael Cohen, who is a professor of international affairs at the New School University in New York City and the director of its doctoral program in public and urban policy. Before coming to the New School in 2001, he had a distinguished career at the World Bank, starting in 1972 and ending in 1999. We're here today to reflect on revisiting sites and services in the 21st century. And the reason that I asked Professor Cohen for an interview is that he was there at the bank when the work on sites and services began and when a couple of decades later it faded away. So Michael, I have a few questions for you. You were there at the outset of the World Bank's involvement with sites and services. Could you tell us how and why this came to be?
Sure. Let's start with defining what is meant by sites and services. So in the early 70s, and probably before, the notion of sites and services was the idea that a public agency would provide serviced land for mostly low-income people, and the people would build their own housing, and the standards of infrastructure and of housing would vary according to the income of the people. So the first project, which was approved in June of 1972, was the Senegal Sites and Service Project in the city of Dakar, as well as in a secondary city. And this involved the government of Senegal tracing out 14,000 plots of land, 150 square meters for each one. And the idea was that these families, roughly 14,000 families, would move onto a site which was about 400 hectares, about 5 miles outside of Dakar. I was hired because I had worked previously in the Ivory Coast and could work in French urban circumstances. So I was asked to try to establish a monitoring and evaluation system for these kinds of projects. So I went on the first supervision mission after the approval of the project. This project, there was an enormous demand for this project. Long lines, hundreds of meters long, of people trying to get into the housing agency to submit applications. And it was clear there was a major housing shortage in the city of Dakar. So we started with sites and services, and the idea had come from a study done by a fellow named Bob Merrill and some others who had gone around the world at the bank's expense to look for successful urban development projects, successful housing. And so what happened was there was agreement that this was a model which, number one, did not require major subsidies from the public sector, that the standards could be variable so that they could reach very poor people. And in the Senegal project, people typically, I think there was one water faucet for every 100 families. So this is rather basic. There was no electricity on the plots. There were street lights on the dirt roads in the project area, and there were pit latrines as the sanitation methods. So this was very basic. And then there were schools and some clinics and a police station and a little other infrastructure. Despite the fact that there was a big demand, there were not that many people moved out to the site, because the problem was that the site was far from the places of work and there wasn't a lot of urban transport. So what happened is that the project evolved very slowly, and 10 years later, in 1982, the government concluded that because there was only 1,800 plots that actually had been taken up, this project was a failure. This project had failed to deliver 14,000 housing solutions for 14,000 families, and 1,800 simply was not enough, and so they decided to cancel the project. The irony is that in that 10-year period, the bank was asked by many other countries to develop similar projects in places as diverse as Calcutta and Nairobi and Dar es Salaam and Lusaka and Rio and Sao Paulo and Mexico City, many different places. So by 1982, there were projects in 36 countries. So this was something that many countries were quite interested in supporting.
Did you expect the people to pay for the plots, or did you expect the project to like full cost recovery from this project at the time? Was that one of the goals of the
Right.
Sites and Services idea?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. So the idea was that people would pay almost a nominal fee for the land, but they would pay also for the services, for water supply and for sanitation and some of the infrastructure. So the project was affordable down to about the bottom 30% or 40% of the income distribution in Dakar. But after all, that wasn't the bottom of the bottom, right? That was sort of in the middle in terms of the income distribution.
Just of my own interest here, the standards in this project probably are below the standards which are the law in a place like Dakar or Senegal. You know, there are probably rules for land subdivision, and that land subdivision has to be fully serviced before it is occupied. There's probably minimum plot size. You're probably not allowed to move into a house before it is complete and you have a certificate of occupancy. The government agreed to this idea of lowering the standards. Were they okay with that? Or were they just giving the bank special dispensation to have special rules, but that others would not be able to copy?
I think you're right when you use the term special dispensation, because the government was never, in my mind, very enthusiastic about not following the building code.
So, what would you say were the objectives of these sites and services projects? And do you think they were attained? You mentioned one, and that is that the bank was unhappy with the fact that it wasn't implemented quickly enough. But in general, what were the objectives? Have they been attained? Did they change over time?
Right. So I think the first issue was, could you actually build and provide low-income services, build housing and low-income infrastructure for low-income families in a way that was affordable? And the answer was yes, you could reduce standards to almost a minimum and people would live there. But the issue, which got very tricky, was the fact that cost recovery was complicated. People in the 70s in Dakar, for example, this was the time of the drought in the Sahel. So in other places, these projects worked better. For example, in Lusaka, they worked. In Zambia, there were some places in India they worked very well. Later in Madras, down Chennai, in South India, they worked very well. But in the very beginning, it was a slow process, and some of the bank's own internal evaluation put its finger on the issue of cost recovery as being a major problem. So some people would have said at the time that the projects were like Swiss watches. They were too finely engineered. And so if a grain of sand got into the watch, the thing would not go properly. And so people said, aha, this may be low-income standards, but institutionally, it requires a lot to pull this off.
I understand that at the time that this was, as you said right from the beginning, designed as a public engagement. It was designed for the government to do this, right?
Right.
Was there ever any discussion or any knowledge, or when Bob Merrill went around, he saw people doing informal land subdivisions. I mean, the private sector, let's say in El Salvador or in Bangkok, they were subdividing and selling land. And was there any interest to bring in the private sector into this, or was it always conceived of as a kind of an alternative to public housing by a public agency?
Well, here's where we have to talk about sort of how ideas changed over time. So I think it's fair to say that from the first project in 72 to the middle of 76 or 77, most of the projects were understood as public housing, as public provision in places like Jamaica, in Brazil, in Mexico, in quite a few places. But in 76, there was another idea emerged. So we developed the term, the challenge of replicability, because even if you could replicate a project, let's say repeat its size and same scale in 5 years, that was good, but it wasn't good enough. And so we began to think more about other kinds of solutions. And in this regard, there's an interesting shift from sites and services to what were called urban management projects. Because one of the comments made in Dakar was nobody came to pick up the garbage in this project. Why was that? Because that project had been worked out with the Ministry of Housing and Public Works, but not with the Ministry of Local Government. So the local government in Dakar really wasn't a player in the project. And that was a mistake. And that was repeated in many places. So we then concluded in the beginning of the 80s, we had to shift more and more to local government.
So at the end of the day, could you explain why the World Bank withdrew from, you started to talk about the shift to urban management, but it withdrew from sites and services, or actually withdrew from the idea of the provision of housing solutions of any kind as a part of its portfolio?
Yeah, I think that what happens is that from the project approach to urban management, then there becomes a concern more about policy, about broad policy, which included the role of the public sector and the private sector. And I think that over time, housing was perceived as less of a priority because, in fact, people were building housing. It just wasn't very good quality, and it didn't have decent services, but it was housing.
So, reflecting on the projects that you were involved with, if you were to do it again, and there is an interest right now in re-engaging in some way, either in a sites and services or some modified form, if you had to do it again, what would you do differently?
Okay, so I think it's useful to step back from the project experience with a little bit more analytic approach to this, which is to say, if you graft the input that coming into these urban projects, typically, that is, if you started from the identification of a project through a feasibility study to appraisal and approval to implementation, you had a bell curve. Okay, and at the moment of loan origination, it was the high point of the use of staff. That's like a mortgage curve in a bank in the United States. Okay, it has nothing to do with developing countries. But if you were thinking that you were interested in building an urban community and you were worried about environmental controls and social impacts, you might have a different curve, which would be more like a U. And the U curve is more of a development curve. It puts more money up front in understanding where you are and the problems, and it leaves money left over for implementation, because all these projects change during implementation anyway. So there was kind of a conflict between the bell curve, which was a banker's curve, and a U curve, which was more of a development curve. So my view is that we need more attention up front in defining what the problems are. So in a project like Dakar, you don't wait 10 years to get people to come to the plots. That's ridiculous. It should have been done the on-site learning before the project should have been much more intensive than later. So my view is that we could have done better in thinking up front about what we were doing and why, and made the implementation arrangements much better. Now let me give you a story here, which is kind of shocking. So I was telling some of this story in my classes at the New School in 2005, and at the end of the class, 8 women came up to me and said, "We want to go see that project in Dakar. You've described this thing, so whatever happened to it?" So we arranged for them to go and to spend June, July of 2006 in Dakar. So we get these excited calls from the team saying, "Michael, you're all wrong. This wasn't a failed project. There are 350,000 people live in this area now." And so I went out there with another faculty member, and we saw that this neighborhood now had 350, maybe 500,000 people. Most of the buildings were multi-story buildings. Every apartment had their own water. There were 55 mosque schools for girls built in this neighborhood. We made it the highest school attendance in the city of Dakar. This was a roaring success. This was an enormous success. So the question I had was, how could this be a success 34 years after it had been decided it was a failure? What's going on here? So the students had the answer. They said, look, the World Bank project started a process. People invested, people built, people improved it, and now it's one of the most favored neighborhoods of Dakar. So the question is, was this a project that was a failure or not? It took a long time to build. 34 years later, you can see a project which we thought didn't work gave birth to something much better and a much more successful project, which, as you're suggesting, included private sector involvement, included private investment, included a lot of community effort.
That's right. And it included planning, because
Yeah.
they laid it out. They
Right.
put the streets in, and they made it possible for this to grow into a community rather than a kind of an irregular slum that you go in and you try to put a road in.
That's right. That's right. My view is that it was premature and probably incorrect to stop financing sites and services, because, as you suggest, the planning was absolutely important. It was important that plots be demarcated, that people knew where they were going to stay, because we know that it's much more expensive to weave a pipe through an existing community than to have plots with right angles and
Right.
laid out in a proper way.
So I think the answer that you give is that you cannot have a project like that done in 3 years. It's too early to tell.
Exactly.
It takes time, and it requires patience, and eventually things turn out to be okay. Thank you. I think this was a wonderful interview.
Great.
Thank you for coming.
Sure. My pleasure.